On the night of March 17th, 1916, when the river wind pushed into the dock sheds of New Orleans a mixed smell of mud, sewage, and burned coal, the city seemed to breathe through cracks. Low smoke from tugboats, the sharp odor of damp burlap sacks, old oil soaked into the wood. Over a workbench covered with bolts, washers, and metal filings, a kerosene lamp trembled, small and insistent, and its flame cast tall shadows on the plank walls warped by humidity, marked by nails and patches, shadows that at that hour felt like warnings. On the other side of the gate, behind piles of hemp rope and supply crates marked in chalk, men waited for an engine that did not yet truly exist. An experimental outboard motor, promised as the solution for crossing swamps with more cargo, without getting stuck in the mud, without losing time, without taking a loss. The math was straightforward and left no room for romance. If the motor was not finished before dawn, a barge carrying flour and medicines to the cypress cutting camps around Barataria and Lafitte would not leave. If the barge did not leave, the dock foreman would not be patient. And if the foreman was not patient, the mechanic's debt to the pawn shop on Magazine Street would keep growing, with interest and fees written into a ledger and secured by tools and metal objects that could not be spared. The pressure that night did not come from newspapers or speeches. It came from the real weight of crates, from the clock crossing midnight, from the distant whistle of a train in the Illinois Central Yard, from the creak of winches and chains, and from the way the dockmen looked at the boat as if it were a stubborn animal that had to obey. The mechanic's name was Étienne Boudreaux. He was 32 years old, with large hands, nails always dark with grease and coal, and small cuts that stung when kerosene splashed. He lived with his wife and a small boy in a narrow house near Chapatula Street, in an area of warehouses and tracks, where the floorboards creaked and rain came in through a loose roof tile, leaving stains on the ceiling and a constant dampness on the walls. Ever since he had learned from an uncle to repair boilers and boat shafts, Étienne's work had been to keep old things running for one more shift, tightening bearings, changing packing, improvising with whatever was in stock. But that year, the dock wanted something new. The swamp was full of narrow channels where ordinary propellers snagged on roots, grass, and debris, and the boats that carried food and tools to the sawyers needed to haul more, because prices were tight and because timber orders kept growing, with sawmills and depots demanding steady volume. The war in Europe, which seemed distant to anyone counting coins at a store counter, still affected everything. The cost of metal rose, imported parts took longer, and some young men who had once worked the dock talked about enlisting in the Army or Navy if the United States entered the conflict the newspapers called the Great War. At the Julia Street dock, though, what mattered was simple and hard. Deliver on time, with minimal loss, avoiding wet cargo, torn sacks, and complaints recorded in writing. The engine on the bench was at once hope and improvisation. The casing came from a used automobile engine, a four-cylinder left as partial payment at a shop, with surface rust and bolts already stripped. The idea was to mount the assembly on a steel column and use a long shaft to spin the propeller outside the hull, like an arm, with a guard to keep it from sucking mud and to reduce the risk of striking logs. Étienne had seen similar drawings in a crumpled catalog that had arrived from Chicago and had heard stories of a man in Biloxi who did something like it for fishing in shallow water. But there, in the wooden shed near the river, everything was trial. Measurements by eye and ruler, worn drill bits, files that had lost their bite. The metal had to be drilled to the right size. The seal had to withstand dirty water, and the propeller could not come loose like a thrown plate, because a loose part in a channel became an immediate danger to hull, line, and people. The lamp gave off a kerosene smell that clung to the throat and mixed with the odor of used oil. Étienne adjusted a nut with a wrench, hearing in the background the river slapping the dock pilings and the crack of swollen wood. From time to time, a man appeared in the doorway and asked how much longer. It was not curiosity. It was keeping score, as if time, too, could be tightened along with the bolts. The foreman's name was Silas O'Rourke, an Irishman aged by sun and outdoor work, in suspenders with a notebook in hand, with a list of names and notes on shifts and absences. He did not need to raise his voice. His calm carried the weight of an order, the calm of someone who controlled cargo, men, and schedules without repeating himself. That night, he came into the shed with his hat in his hand, looked at the bench and the lamp as if that were too little for what was being demanded, and said the barge would have to leave before 6, with or without the new motor, because the contract with the swamp camps allowed no delay. He also said the owner of the supply warehouse on Decatur Street had already complained about the last shipment, which had arrived wet, with softened cardboard and watermarks on the sacks. And he reminded Étienne, without saying his name, that there were plenty of people who could tighten bolts, people who would take less and ask no questions. Étienne did not answer with bravado. He only nodded and went back to work, focused on the sound of metal and the fit of parts, as if the answer lay in precision and not in speech. Beside him, a young man named Tomás Aguilar, the son of a Spaniard who sold fruit at the French market, held a hand lantern and passed parts, his fingers stained with oil and filings. Tomás was 19, quick to smile, and carried an anxiety that showed whenever the foreman passed by. He had learned to file and measure with Étienne and followed him as one follows a path firmer than one's own, repeating gestures, waiting for approval without asking for it. On the bench, a small pocket watch, sometimes stopped for lack of winding, marked time irregularly. Even so, Étienne's body knew the hours. Dawn approaching when the city quieted the noise of carriages and wheels on cobblestones, and the damp cold came in through gaps in the wood, sticking his shirt to his back. He thought of his wife, Amélie, who sewed buttons for a shop on Canal Street, and who, that same week, had said the boy needed new shoes before the heat of April, when old leather split and a foot grew. He thought of the landlord knocking at the door. He thought of what it meant to deliver that motor as a promise and not as a certainty, knowing a promise did not pay rent or medicine. At the end of February, Étienne had visited, at O'Rourke's request, one of the Cypress camps to the south, in a region of channels that wound between tall reeds and trees hung with moss. It was a place that smelled of sawdust, smoke, and sweat, with plank floors on pilings and mud underneath. He had seen men in soaked trousers pushing logs, had seen a cook stirring a cauldron of beans, had seen a feverish boy in a hammock. There, a camp foreman had said the last provisions had arrived late and short, and that if the boat bogged down again, someone could die of illness or hunger. It was not an empty threat. It was life counted in days, in fever and lack of food. The sentence, spoken without drama, had lodged in Étienne's head like a stone in a pocket. That was why, on that March night, what drove his hands was not only fear of the dock foreman. It was the image of crates of quinine and flour left behind, the idea of men isolated in the swamp, dependent on a vessel that always failed. New Orleans could dance and play music on Saturday, but the muddy interior lived on deliveries. And delivery depended on metal and adjustment, on packing seated properly and a nut tightened to the right point. Near 2 a.m, when the engine was finally assembled enough for a test, Étienne and Tomás carried it to the edge of the dock with the care of people carrying a heavy baby, feeling the dead weight of iron and the risk of slipping on damp planks. The river was dark, with reflections of distant lights and the smell of something rotten from the banks, mixed with oil and floating trash. A small workboat, a shallow-holed launch called Marguerite, was tied up with ropes worn at the knots and marked by chafing. It was old with peeling paint, but it had room for cargo and for an improvised motor. The plan was simple and, for that very reason, relentless. Mount the assembly on the stern, start it, and see whether the propeller turned without choking, whether the column vibrated too much. An old man named Jules Landry, a swamp pilot who knew the channels the way one knows the wrinkles of one's own hand, showed up in a thin wool coat with an unlit pipe. He owned nothing. He worked by trip, paid by route and risk. He had light eyes and a way of speaking little, as if each word had to justify the space it took. Jules looked at the motor, ran his hand along the steel column, feeling the weld and the roughness of the bead, and then looked at Étienne before saying that river water did not forgive haste. The test began with the sound of a crank and an engine's cough. The first attempt failed. The carburetor spat, and the smell of raw gasoline rose into the air, cutting through kerosene and oil. Étienne adjusted the mixture, cleaned a spark plug, and tried again. On the second attempt, the engine caught, shaking the stern of the Marguerite. The lamp, hanging from a hook, trembled with the vibration. Tomás held the lantern and smiled as if the world had changed. Jules kept his hand on the tiller, not smiling, attentive to hull and line. For a few minutes, the propeller spun with a new sound, higher pitched than the old engines, and the water behind the boat foamed. Étienne felt relief, but did not let his body relax. He watched the shaft, the seal, any sign of leakage. The engine seemed alive, but an engine's life could end with a snap, and a snap in the swamp cost more than a part. O'Rourke appeared again, now with two men carrying boxes for the larger barge that would make the trip at dawn. He saw the foam and said only that it had better work in the swamp as well, where the mud was thicker than that river water and where the bank offered no dock for repairs. On the morning of March 18th, with the sky still gray and dampness clinging to clothing, the Marguerite was towed to the departure point, near where the river met channels leading south, where the water began to run lower and brown. The plan was to use the experimental motor as support to push a cargo barge, not as the sole power. The barge carried sacks of flour, crates of tools, a few bottles of medicine, and even a bundle of letters someone had left at the warehouse for a brother in the camp. There was also a crate of spare parts for a saw. All of it had a smell: flour, wood, metal, paper, and the faint mold of storage. Étienne did not usually go on trips. His work was in the shop, not in the mud. But O'Rourke said that if the motor failed, no one but Étienne would know how to fix it on the way, and added that the extra pay would cover part of the debts. Étienne accepted without arguing, because refusing would give someone else a reason to take his place. Tomás insisted on going too, to help with tools. Jules would be the pilot. They left in silence. The river, at that hour, seemed like a wide, indifferent road. They passed other boats, men who waved without cheer, gulls that looked dirty. As they moved away from the center, the air changed. Less smoke, more vegetation, and still water. The sound of the experimental motor was steady, but there was a vibration Étienne felt in the bone of his arm when he touched the column. He made small adjustments with the boat in motion, tightening a nut, watching the temperature of the cooling water, checking that the seal was not letting water in, alert to the smell of overheating and the rhythm of the spin. When they entered narrower channels, the world grew lower and more enclosed. Tall reeds, trees hung with moss, brown water with patches of oil and leaves. The city's noise disappeared. There, the motor had to prove what it promised: push cargo without burying the propeller in mud. Jules steered calmly, avoiding submerged logs. The barge followed behind, tied by a line, creaking when the tension changed. For hours, everything worked. The propeller, protected by a kind of metal cage Étienne had devised from reused bars, cut the water without snagging as much. In some shallow spots, when the bottom nearly touched, Jules ordered them to slow and choose the deeper path, and the Marguerite managed to pull the barge with effort, but without stopping. Tomás, sitting near the crates, wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at Étienne as if he were seeing a future, as if that motor were a way out of the roughest labor. In the early afternoon, the sky darkened in a way that was not night. Heavy clouds rose from the south, and the wind began to push water against the banks. Jules looked up and then ahead, and changed course to find a more sheltered stretch. In the swamp, a storm had no bell to warn you. It arrived with the sound of leaves and the smell of hot rain, and with the water's surface changing in minutes. The first blow came thick and heavy, and water hammered the channel, throwing up spray. In moments, their clothes were soaked through, clinging to the body like weight. The spare lamp, kept in a box, became a useless object. The motor kept running, but the rain cooled it and, at the same time, hid signs. Any leak looked like part of the storm, and the noise of water muffled what had been audible before. At a stretch where the channel made a tight bend, Jules slowed. A large log lay partly submerged, and he tried to go around it. The barge behind, heavy, pulled them outward from the curve. The line went taut. The Marguerite tilted. At that instant, the spinning propeller struck something hard on the bottom, perhaps a root, perhaps scrap iron, and the impact was like a punch. There was a sharp metallic crack, followed by a violent shudder. The motor column shook, and a mounting piece gave way, opening play where there could be no play. Tomás, by instinct, stood up to catch the lantern as it rolled. The boat lurched. His hand slipped on the wet wood. He fell backward, struck his head on the edge of a crate, and before anyone could reach him, fell into the brown, heavy water, which was not like falling into a clean river. It was water that pulled you down with soaked clothes and boots, with a short, treacherous current in a narrow channel. Jules let go of the tiller for a second to try to grab the boy, but the boat was still moving and the barge was pulling. Étienne threw himself to the edge and stretched out his arm, feeling the cold water rise. Tomás surfaced for an instant, eyes wide, trying to say something the rain swallowed. There was no time to pull off boots. The current, sped up by the storm, carried him under the side of the boat. The line between the Marguerite and the barge vibrated, dangerous, like a tense snake, ready to injure if anyone got tangled. Jules shouted an order to cut the engine. Étienne reached the lever and shut it down, and the engine silence was a shock in the middle of the storm. The boat lost momentum. The barge bumped lightly, pushing the stern. Étienne and Jules pulled ropes, threw a line into the water, but the channel was narrow and the water was a whirl of leaves. For seconds that were too long, there was nothing but rain and the sound of their own hearts in their ears. When Tomás reappeared farther ahead, he no longer moved the same way. Jules managed to catch his shirt with the hook of a pole. They hauled hard, scraping their arms on wood and metal, and brought the body to the edge, heavy with water. On deck, under rain, Étienne pressed the boy's chest, tried to force air, tried to find a rhythm. Jules held his head, trying to keep his face out of the water running down. The swamp offered no miracle. Tomás's body went limp, and his gaze fixed on some point that was no longer the channel. The sound of rain continued unchanged, indifferent. There was no fixing that, no tightening of a nut. It was the kind of event that does not reverse. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving a washed sky and a strange silence. The channel was filled with leaves and small branches. The Marguerite rocked, now without power. The broken mounting piece had left the column loose, and the shaft was bent. The barge was still attached, but the line now seemed like a threat. Jules, his hands trembling, tied the boat to a tree and stared at Tomás's body, laid on a tarp, as if waiting for him to breathe on his own. Étienne sat on the deck, water dripping from his hair, and looked at his own hands. He did not cry theatrically. He sat with an emptiness that felt like a physical space inside his chest. He thought of Tomás's father at the French market, of the way the boy held the lantern, of the trust he placed in the future. Death there was not a newspaper matter. It was a weight that would return with them to the city, stuck to their clothes like mud, and that could not be washed away with river water. Jules decided there was no choice. They had to continue. The barge carried medicine and food, and turning back would mean losing days. But the experimental motor, the reason they were there, was broken. Without it, pulling that load through the shallow stretches would be nearly impossible. But Jules knew an alternate route, longer and deeper, that passed near bayou rigolets and avoided some mud banks. He said, in a low voice, that the body would have to be taken along, because leaving it in the swamp would be a dishonor. It was not a speech. It was a simple rule among people who live with water, where what is lost becomes news only for those who return. Étienne stood up and began to work as if work were the only thing that still obeyed. With wet tools, he dismantled the broken mount. He used a metal bar and strips of leather from an old belt to improvise a reinforcement, tightening with what he had and testing the play with his hand. The bench shaft could not be straightened perfectly, but it could turn slowly, carefully, without breaking completely. He tightened, tested again. The motor could no longer push at full force, but perhaps it would give enough thrust to help in bends and in stretches against the current, where oar and pole were not enough. When the motor was started again, it coughed and then caught with a harsher sound, as if complaining. Jules piloted at low speed. The barge followed, heavy, and the day turned to late afternoon and then dusk. No lamp was lit. The sky still gave enough light, and then weak stars came, cut by mosquitoes. Tomás's body remained covered, secured so it would not roll. From time to time, Étienne looked at the tarp and looked away quickly, as if looking too long might break him. They reached the Cypress camp late at night, March 18th already turning into 19, with lanterns appearing among the trees like fireflies. Men ran to help them tie up. The cook shouted to bring the flour sacks. A man in an apron took the medicine crate as if it were gold. No one celebrated. When they saw the tarp and the way Jules and Étienne carried it, the camp went quiet. A foreman removed his hat. Someone made the sign of the cross. There were no questions for details. Everyone there knew the swamp well enough to understand, and they knew an accident did not need a long explanation. Tomás's body was placed in a small plank building used as storage, away from the kitchen fire, to wait for the return. Jules said they would leave at dawn so as not to lose the route. Étienne sat on a log near the water, listening to frogs and the distant crack of wood being cut. Work that did not stop because of a dead man. A camp worker brought black coffee in a tin cup. Étienne drank without tasting, as if the heat were only a memory. On the way back, the improvised motor held until halfway, groaning, overheating, requiring stops to cool. In one stretch, the leather strap snapped, and Étienne had to redo the lashings with a strip cut from the strap of his own tool bag. The work was done in the dark, with a weak lantern, hands bitten by mosquitoes. All the while, Tomás's body was there, a mute presence, turning every decision into responsibility. The barge, now lighter, helped. Even so, the return was slow, and the sun of March 20th was already high when they finally saw the wider river and, in the distance, the city's smoke with its warehouses and chimneys. At the New Orleans dock, routine did not stop to receive them. Men were unloading other goods. Carriages passed. Vendors shouted. Whistles blew and would struck wood. O'Rourke stood with his notebook, looking at his watch. When he saw the twisted motor and Étienne's face, he understood before any explanation. He did not ask whether the delivery had been made. He saw on the cargo record that the barge had returned empty of the main items. He asked only the dead man's name, and, when he heard it, closed the notebook slowly, as if ending a line he had not wanted to write. Tomás's body was taken in a simple cart to a house in the French Market neighborhood. The father, in an apron stained with fruit, opened the door and stood still, as if the world had lost the instruction to continue. There was no scene of screaming. There was a heavy silence and a trembling hand touching the tarp. The mother, behind him, let out a low sound, as if short of breath. Étienne stood outside, hat in hand, unable to offer anything that mattered. Jules said a few words, promising the boy had not been left alone in the swamp. It was true, and it was the only possible comfort, because the rest was only emptiness. In the days that followed, the dock kept pressing for deliveries. The experimental motor, now marked by failure and death, became a subject of whispering among men who knew the risk but needed the wages. Some said it was madness to try something new in treacherous water. Others said that without something new, the business would die anyway, because time and cost did not forgive. O'Rourke, pragmatic, told Étienne to fix what he could and go back to using old engines where necessary. But he did not cancel the idea. Timber still had to go out. Provisions still had to come in. The city did not stop for a private tragedy, and the dock was built to ignore what did not fit in the notebook. Étienne returned to the shop on Julius Street, and the lamp was lit again at night. The motor sat disassembled for days, parts lined up like bones on the bench, with impact marks and twisted metal. Each time he picked up a piece, the crack in the channel returned, the weight of the wet body. It was not fear of water. It was a new awareness that every poorly tightened bolt could cut through a life. He began to measure twice, to test calmly, to refuse haste when haste was only a contract's whim. It cost him scoldings, looks, a day's pay docked, but it also prevented other small accidents that had once been accepted as part of the job. Crushed fingers, loose parts, things the dock treated as inevitable. On Sunday, March 26, 1916, there was a simple wake for Tomás at St. Louis Church, not in the cathedral full of visitors, but in a smaller chapel where working families crowded into worn pews with the smell of wax and damp clothing. The coffin was cheap. There were ordinary flowers, bought with pooled coins. Étienne stood in the back, beside Jules and a few dockmen. The priest spoke of water and passage, in words that promised no explanation, only rest. When the coffin was carried out, the sound of footsteps on stone seemed louder than it should have, as if the whole building were listening. The following week, Étienne gave Tomás's father a small leather pouch with the boy's tools, a file, a pocket knife, a short pencil. They were clean, but still smelled of oil. The father held the pouch as if holding a piece of his son and nodded without being able to say much. Étienne left with the feeling that the entire city was made of doors that closed slowly and of things that did not open again. In April, the heat arrived hard and the river rose a little. Mosquitoes grew thicker toward late afternoon. The shop began working with the doors open to let air circulate, and the lamp was lit only late. Étienne, with stubborn calm, redesigned the outboard motor's mounting. He used better steel, bought a high cost from a supplier on Poydras Street, and made a firmer guard for the propeller, with bars more securely fastened and less play. There was no money for long tests, so he tested the way he could, on the river, in short runs at hours when the dock did not need everything. Jules helped when he could, because he also carried the weight of what had happened, even without saying so. He no longer spoke of shortcuts. He spoke of safe banks, of slowing before the bend, of not trusting water that looked smooth. At the end of May, on a clear morning of May 28, 1916, the Marguerite made a short trip to a stretch of channel known for mudbanks. It carried a smaller load, only to test. The new motor pushed slowly, without a crack, without excessive vibration. Étienne watched every sound, every splash, and felt something like relief, but it was not joy. It was only the recognition that work could go on without denying what had happened. When they returned to the dock, O'Rourke looked at the motor and said it might save time and money. Then, in the same neutral voice, he said Tomás would have liked to see it. Summer advanced, and the city continued with its routines. Streetcars passing on St. Charles Avenue, men unloading sacks of coffee, women buying cloth, children running after carts. In the swamp, the camps continued to depend on deliveries, and the boats continued to face mud and roots. The experimental motor, now less improvisation and more tool, began to be used on some trips, always with care, always with an extra repair kit, always with a silent respect for the channel where the water had taken a young man, and with the memory that an impact on the bottom could become death in seconds. At Étienne's house, the boy got new shoes in early June, paid for with the extra from a few trips and with additional nights in the shop. Amelie hemmed a seam and patched the roof. There was no celebration. The money brought no lightness. It brought only the possible continuation, with bills paid and food secured for one more month. At the end of that year, when the air cooled and the smell of smoke began to appear again in the mornings, Étienne passed through the French market and saw Tomás's father selling fruit in the same apron, now more worn. The two greeted each other with a short nod, as people do when they recognize something that does not need to be said. The dock, the river, the channels, everything looked the same from a distance, but a difference had been set in place like a mark in wood. The work was no longer only delivery and deadline. It was also the memory of a body pulled from the water and a tarp tied down on the deck. On the night of December 31st, 1916, when distant fireworks burst over the city and the lamp once again lit the workbench, Étienne closed the toolbox carefully and snuffed the flame. Outside, the river ran dark and slow, carrying reflections and debris, indifferent to the calendar and to human promises. But inside the shed, the silence had a defined outline, as if every object were in its proper place. The outboard motor, now stored with spare parts and notes on brown paper, was no longer a blind gamble, but an instrument marked by real cost. Life on the dock would continue to demand haste, and the swamp would continue to demand attention. But in that turn of the year, there was a kind of possible order made of routine, care, and remembrance, and it was enough to get through the night and reach the next day with a right weight of things. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.